showing up. I know mid-August is not the best time to discuss classical history. So, I'm glad to introduce Professor Najam Haidar. He's assistant professor at Columbia's Barnard College. He got his PhD from Princeton and MPhil from Oxford. Najam teaches modern and pre-modern Islamic tradition at Barnard. His main areas of research are the impact of colonization on Islamic political and religious discourse. His focus is also on the formation of sectarian identities in the pre-modern Islamic world and the role of Islamic law in the modern Muslim world. Recently, he has a book out, Shia Islam, an Introduction, Oxford University Press Studies. Cambridge. And that is a book that he promised to give me a copy of. It examines the development of Shia Islam through the lens of belief, narrative, and memory, and it covers for the first time in English a wide diversity of Shia communities ranging from the predominant demographic 12 Shiism to more understudied communities like Zaydi Shi'is and Ismailis. Before that, his other book is The Origins of Shia Identity, Ritual, and Sacred Space in 8th Century Kufa. In that book, the study was made about the development of an independent Shia identity, in particular Imami identity, with focus on the development of certain rituals and sacred spaces, which went against the trend up to that point of trying to study the formation of identity based on theological doctrines. And that book was a breakthrough in our understanding of the development of Imami identity and so forth. Today he's going to talk about the historiographical study of Yahya ibn Abd Allah. Now, we will have more to say about that, but one thing that we mentioned is that unfortunately we're not going to have Najam here, whose work on Yahya ibn Abd Allah was seminal and very important. After that, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you to Hussein for inviting me. He invited me once a long time ago, and I managed to not show up in December, so thanks for being flexible about that, and thank you for the introduction. I want to apologize at the start because this is very much of a talk in progress. It's the first time I'm presenting this material, and so I'm actually glad that we have a small group of people, so I won't embarrass myself amongst a larger crowd. But it's also quite a complicated topic that I'm discussing. So the chart over there, which right now makes very little sense to you, will hopefully be a good reference point as I speak. So, and I'm going to try not to be too technical, because this can be very technical. It's drawn from a chapter that's about 74 pages long, and it just goes on and on in a way that is unforgivable. So I'm going to try to focus on one aspect of this chapter and try to explain to you what my new project is about and how I'm sort of working through it. Before doing that, I'm going to hopefully take up, my plan is to take up no more than 30 minutes. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Islamic historiography and what we know, so some background is needed. For those of you some of you may know this, and I apologize for that, others may not. Some historical studies, especially in the early period, focus very, very strongly on the idea, especially over the last 50 years, on the question of whether the material that we possess is mostly fictional or whether that material is truthful. It conveys some degree of accurate information about the early period. The earliest scholars we find in the 50s and the 60s generally assume that because there were chains of transmission attached to specific reports, that there was a degree of veracity, that's what the scholars themselves were going for, or at least the appearance of veracity. That's not to say that all the material was truthful, but that the primary normative value of the material was a decision to try to convey what actually happened in the past. This all began to change in the 80s, one could say, with the work of Albrecht, Noth, and others, who showed that oftentimes Muslim historians would take areas in which they had very little knowledge and fill them with what he called topos and schemata, so themes and generic descriptions, transmitting them from one area to another. In other words, what we ended up with was a landscape of Islamic historiography that was largely formulaic, as opposed to being any truthful conveyance of what actually happened. The mantle that Noah put forward, and he didn't say that all history was like this, all Islamic history was like this, but he said large sections were. And he was particularly interested in conquest narratives. And other people built upon this work. The most prominent in the modern period, I would argue, the two most prominent are Osman Leader and Tayyib al-Dibri. And when Leader is specifically interested in the fictional nature of Islamic historiography. He says that there's some truth in there, but for the most part he argues that it is so small and so unretrievable that we have to treat these texts as if they are fiction. Of course, there are lots of problems here, primarily the idea that fiction is a modern European construct that is then being projected upon an entire literary tradition. But I will leave my criticism of Leader aside. Tayyib al-Hibri does something slightly different. And what he does is he argues that Islamic historical writing is so seeped in parabolic references to biblical narratives and other early narratives that it is virtually irretrievable. And what we end up with Tayyib al-Hibri, who's not here so I can say this, is an incredibly self-referential psychological examination of Tayyib al-Hibri as opposed to the source material itself. I'm going to take a different approach, and the approach I take is an approach that was sort of hinted at and elaborated by Julie Maysami, who is now Professor Emeritus at Oxford, but who was primarily interested in literature. She was a professor of Adab. And at one point, in a couple of seminal articles, she pointed out the fact that whereas we take other sources, other Islamic traditions, and we connect them to late antiquity, and we build off of that connection to late antiquity. When it comes to Islamic historiography, essentially what we end up doing is connecting it to what came after. So we connect it to medieval European historiography and the scientification of history that we find in the 19th and 20th centuries. What she argues is Islamic history is historical in the sense of classical history. So she says the connection between Tabari and Cicero is much stronger than the connection between Tabari and anyone in the modern period. And what does she mean by this? Well, she says that rhetorical historical writing, and that's what Cicero did, involved a number of things. The first was a performative nature of interaction between the chronicler, the historian, and the audience. But in that performative nature, you needed to have a chronology that was understood. So if I'm a historian, if I'm Cicero, I'm going to keep bringing up Cicero. If I'm Cicero and I'm presenting a historical piece on Julius Caesar, the assumption is that everybody knows who Julius Caesar is. Everybody knows what Julius Caesar's life was like. And what I'm expected to do is to apply that life to a situation to make a rhetorical point. I'm supposed to elaborate in some areas, I'm supposed to de-emphasize other areas. So what Cicero is doing is he is playing around with a narrative that is known. But it is essential that the audience already know what happened in order for Cicero to make the point that he's trying to make. So this is what she says Islamic historiography is primarily like. It is rhetorical in nature. It assumes the audience's knowledge, and then it plays off of that knowledge to make a point. This has a couple of implications. The first is that the argument of veracity versus fiction is left to the margins, because the veracity is already there. It is imbued in the fact that the audience knows what happened. So the historian doesn't have to show what happened. The historian isn't meant to explain to you. He's not trying to tell you the story of Julius Caesar. He is taking your knowledge of Julius Caesar, and he's making a point with it. Now, Michael Cooperson built upon this and said that this elaboration and this changing in emphasis had to adhere to two standards. The first standard was a standard of plausibility, and the second standard was a standard of verisimilitude. Plausibility meaning that what the historian is telling you, what the rhetorical historian is telling you, and that's what I'm going to refer to them from this point forward as, what the rhetorical historian is telling you has to be plausible within your belief structure. So if somebody comes to us and says, oh look, the seventh Imam, Musa Kazim, talked to lions, we're going to say, that's not very plausible. But within the mental construct of the period in which Tabari is writing, or Mufid, a Shi'i scholar, is writing, the idea that you could talk to animals is perfectly plausible, not to mention that it's Quranic. Or the idea that you could travel long distances immediately. I mean, that's what Suleiman's jinn does when he brings the throne back from Sheba. The idea is that if you used a word of God, a name of God, you could traverse long distances at once. It's plausible. So whatever the historian does has to be plausible within the structure of the beliefs of the audience. It also has to be versimilar. And what I mean by that is when we know a broad narrative already, you can't just present an interpretation of an event or a person that strongly breaks from what is already known about the person's life. So let's say we have a figure who's known to have been in prison his entire life and quite a sad man. And you can't have him be suddenly an activist superstar because it breaks the verisimilitude that the audience expects of the narrative. So within these constraints, the idea is that what Muslim historians are doing is practicing a rhetorical version of history that is much more in line with what the Byzantines and the Romans did than what we do today, historically. And by doing so, we're sidestepping the idea of veracity versus fiction altogether. A second point that I should just quickly mention is the idea here is that the audience knows this is happening. So it's not as if the audience is being played for a fool. The audience is aware that the historian is doing this. So that's sort of the broad theoretical framework in which I'm trying to rethink or think about history and historiography in the early period. And what I want to do today is just give you one part of one chapter, one example, one very, you're going to think it's not that simple, but trust me, it is more simple than the rest of the chapter. So one example of how this works. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to focus on Yahya ibn Abd Allah. I'll explain to you who he was, names up there. And yes, it's too bad Maher can't be here because he's done a lot of the seminal work on this individual. I'm going to do this in 3 steps. In the first step, I'm going to lay out what we know about Yahya. And what I'm suggesting here is this is what everybody who is an educated individual in society already knew about Yahya. This is the chronology. This is the established narrative. And then I'm going to look at one part of Yahya's life and how Sunni sources, and I know that this is incredibly, reductionist. And there's much more diversity than I'm letting on here, and I'm aware of that diversity. And I mentioned that diversity in the chapter, but I can't mention it here. How the Sunni sources deal with that part of Yahya's life and why they deal with it in that way. And then I'm going to look at the Zaydi sources, 4 of them, but taken together, and how they deal with it. And in doing so, I'm going to try to show what the rhetorical point of both positions was. And in doing so, maybe demonstrate how this approach to history gives you a much better understanding of what the historians were doing than, again, going into an account and trying to figure out what quote-unquote really happened, or saying, it's fiction, it's a novel, we're reading a novel. So, let me just begin by, I hate reading. I don't read talks. I really hate reading talks. But there's some things that need to be read. So I'm going to read the chronology that seems to exist about Yahya's life, that explains who he is and lays out what people may have already known. This is the skeleton upon which historians built sort of fleshy parts. It's what they decided they wanted to focus on or not focus on. So I'm going to start with that. Yahya ibn Abdullah ibn Hassan, ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, was the younger, paternal half-brother to the Alid rebels Nafs Zakiya and Ibrahim. His mother was Qurayba bint Ruqay ibn Abi Ubaidah. The exact year of his birth is unknown, but he was orphaned after his father's imprisonment and death at the order of the Caliph Mansur during the revolt of his brothers in Iraq and I'm going to stick to Hijrah because we're in the Arab world, 145. There's no information regarding Yahya's early life other than the fact that he was raised by the 6th 12er Imam, Ja'far Sadiq, who oversaw his education and, at least according to the Zaydis, designated him as one of his legatees after his death. Yahya first enters the historical stage during the rebellion of Sa'id Fakh al-Husayn ibn Ali in 169 in Medina. Zaydi sources ascribe the revolt to the policies of the new Abbasid Caliph al-Hadi, which included the forced relocation of many Alids to Medina and the appointment of a governor, Umar ibn Abdulaziz al-Umari, who was particularly hostile to Alids. And from what we know, this governor instituted some really draconian policies meant at targeting specifically Alids in Medina. When the rebellion broke out, Yahya was one of the catalysts, one of the leaders of the rebellion. In fact, he led a small party that seized control of the Prophet's mosque one morning prior to the morning prayer, and that led to the outbreak of this rebellion again in 169. The Abbasids, as they always did, crushed the rebellion. The Alids scattered. Many of them went to Mecca. They mixed with caravans for the pilgrimage, and many of them dispersed in that way. Amongst those who dispersed was Yahya and his brother Idris. Yahya eventually first went to Abyssinia, then he went to a bunch of other places over the next 7 years, including Armenia and the Hijaz and Baghdad, before finally arriving in Iran and launching his own rebellion, which took place in 176. As these rebellions often happen, as happens in most of these rebellions, the rebellion was crushed by the Abbasids. He then accepted an aman from Harun al-Rashid and accompanied Abbasids from Iran back to Baghdad. Then there's a gap of about 9 years between 176 and 185, during which we don't know exactly what happened, but at some point Rashid violated his agreement, arrested Yahya. There's a suggestion in the sources that he played a part in the fall of the Barmakids in 186, and then he died in prison in 187. Now this is a fairly, there's 10 points I can lay out here, but there's a very clear chronology of what happens to Yahya. He's born, date unknown. He is related to these three important Alid rebels, all of whom are far more important than he is. But my point here is that Yahya isn't an obscure person. He's a brother to two Alids who launched possibly the most threatening rebellion against the Abbasids, led by Alids. And his other brother, Idris, founded the Idrisid dynasty in North Africa. So he's not an unknown, Yahya. He's connected to Sadiq, 12er Imam. He takes part in this rebellion. He flees. He launches his own rebellion. He signs an aman. At some point, he's arrested. Who knows? He may have participated in the downfall of this important Vizier dynasty, and then he's killed in prison. Now, in my talk, I'm only going to focus on one aspect of his life, as it's portrayed in the sources, and that is the period after he accepts the aman to the point where he is arrested. Okay? So the question, the area I'm really looking at is, when did Rashid turn on Yahya? And why did he turn on Yahya? It's a very small segment of this life. And the chapter itself goes through the entire life, which again, as I reread for the first time, after having written a draft, it's really hard to read my own writing. So I'm just going to focus on this one area. So let's start with the Sunni sources. And this is where this is going to come in a little bit handy, because there are 4 narratives that everybody cites. And I've given the narratives these easy names, or not so easy names, for you to remember them. The first narrative is the Abdullah ibn Musab narrative. The second is the conspiracy narrative. Third is the companion name narrative. And the fourth is the lineage narrative. I will explain what these are in time. But let's start with the Sunni sources. And how do the Sunni sources cover this turning of the caliph on Yahya? How are they described? Now, both of the narratives that the Sunnis cite, there are 2 variants of one narrative. That's the narrative of Abdullah ibn Musab. And let me explain to you what this narrative is. For now, I'm just going to refer to it as the Abdullah narrative. The narrative begins as such. I'll give you the 2 Sunni versions. The first Sunni version is related by an Alid. The narrator's name is Abdullah ibn Abbas ibn Hassan ibn Ubaidullah ibn Abbas ibn Ali. Those of you who, no doubt, have memorized Isfahani's Kitab al-Aghani will know that his father, Abbas ibn Hassan, was a famous Abbasid poet who was known to run with 2 Abbasid caliphs, Rashid and Mansur. He was a companion, a boon companion. So Abdullah is telling a story about his father. And he says, Abdullah and I, my father and I, were wanting to visit the Caliph Rashid one day, and Rashid was in a bad mood and he didn't want anyone to visit him. But we showed up and Rashid said, "Oh, come on in." So he gave us entry. So this was a real honor. These Alids were being invited into the presence of Rashid on a bad day. Now the chamberlain at the time, a man by the name of Al-Fadl ibn Rabi, very famous chamberlain of the Abbasids, didn't like this. So he showed up while the Alids were in the presence of the Caliph and said, "Oh, someone else is at the door. It's Abdullah ibn Musab, who was a Zubairid," which is, there's a lot going on there. The Zubairids had launched their own rebellion at some point, very early against the Umayyads, and were themselves seen as threats, one could say. And they had no defenders at this point. But Abdullah ibn Musab was a companion of the Abbasids, and the Zubayrids had ruled Medina on behalf of the Abbasids for a long time. So Fadl says, oh, someone else is here to come to see you. The narrator's father then says to the narrator, oh, he's just saying that because he wants our honor to be diminished because we were allowed entry when no one else was. So the caliph says, okay, fine, let him in. When he enters, the Zubayrid, Abdullah, says, oh, I just have to let you know, Yahya ibn Abdullah, he's causing problems. And there's a rebellion that's about to break out in Medina, and it's all Yahya's fault. At this point, Rashid says, bring me Yahya. So Yahya is brought, and Yahya says, don't listen to him. He's just trying to cause dissension between Abbasids and Alids. He's trying to cleave the family in half. And Abdullah Zubayrid says, oh, no, I'm telling you. So both people take oaths. Yahya says, I swear I'm not doing this. Abdullah says, I swear I've heard this and he's doing this. At which point, Rashid decides he's going to arrest Yahya, just in case, and Abdullah is free to go. So here the story takes sort of a pause, and the two Alids who had witnessed this go back to their homes. Later on, the Zubayrid sends a messenger to the two Alids and says, I think you should inform against Yahya. And the veiled threat here is that if you don't, I'm going to accuse you of the same thing. So the narrator's father sends the narrator, who again is an Alid, to the house of the Zubayrid who has launched these accusations up to him. But before he gets to the house, he realizes that the Zubayrid has died. The implicit idea here is he's died because he gave a false oath. Then the caliph calls the Alids and says, have you heard the news? And the Alids say, oh yeah, we've heard the news. And then they all praise God that the Alids and the Abbasids were going to be divided by this man, but somehow it's all been saved. Then Yahya is brought out, and Yahya says, see, I told you I was telling the truth. And Yahya is let go and given 200,000 dinars, which, by the way, is a lot of money in that context. So that's the first story. The second variant of the story is slightly different, but still an Abdullah story. And that story is that it's told by an Abbasid as opposed to an Alid. In this case, the narrator is Isa bin Jafar, who's the son of Mansur, I believe. Was the grandson of Mansur, sorry. So here we have Isa bin Jafar, he's sitting in a room and he just starts laughing. And one of his companions says, why are you laughing? And he goes, you won't believe what I saw at court today. And so then he tells a very similar story where Abdullah, the Zubayrid, shows up and says, this man, he's launching a rebellion. And Yahya says, trust me, we're brothers, we're cousins, you shouldn't listen to Zubayrid's telling you crazy things about us. And at that point, Yahya does something interesting. He turns the issue around and says, oh, Zubayrid, he wrote a poem in favor of Nasr Zakiya, and he cursed Mansur. And Abdullah says, no, I never did that. And Yahya says, oh yeah, and then he quotes a poem, the actual poem that is cursing Mansur. At which point, Abdullah says, I will take an oath. And Yahya says, oh, no. I will tell you which oath to take. And the oath he takes is, may I be deprived of God's strength and power and abandoned to my own strength and power if I really said that poem. And he trembles as he says this oath, and then he dies. So these are the two Sunni narratives, and there's something really interesting going on here. And what I want to point out is, despite the differences in the two narratives, the central point here is about kinship. It's about the Abbasids. It has nothing to do with Yahya. It has to do with the relationship between the Abbasids and the Alids. It's all about what this relationship was predicated upon and why it broke down. And in this case, Abdullah ibn Musab, a Zubayrid, is seen as being the dividing force. But so is Fadl, the chamberlain. And the idea here is that these families belong together, even though they compete. But outside forces and forces within the court try to divide them. And so what Sunni sources are doing, and Antoine Beirut has pointed this out when he talks about what he calls an Abbasid Vulgate of history. What's going on here is that these imperial historians, and that's really what they are, like Tabari, are putting forth a broad narrative about the Abbasids, in which Yahya plays only a minor marginal role. The story is more about Abdullah and about the dividing of kin than it is about Yahya. Yahya is incidentally present to facilitate the narrative. That's what's going on here. And this is just one instance, but you see this over and over again. What Sunni sources, like Tabari, And there's one exception to this, and that's Khatib Baghdadi. But what most Sunni sources are doing is that they're interested in in Abbasid Khalifa politics and posturing, and they're trying to explain the downfall of the Abbasids. And one of the ways they do that is emphasizing split in the Prophet's family. That's the purpose. Yahya only plays that role. He shows up over and over again in the same way. He's like the guy you bring up to explain what happened. He's like the magic, he's almost magical in his biography. It's like, oh, the Burma kings fell? It must be Yahya's fault. So they bring Yahya in. Oh, the governorships changed in Tabaristan? I think Yahya was involved in that. So Yahya just shows up as sort of this agent of change. So that's what Sunni sources are doing. It's mostly about kinship. And we see this, because that's the only narrative in which they explain the turn of Rashid on Yahya. And in fact, what most Sunni sources say is, he gave Yahya an iman, Yahya came to Baghdad, he was honored, then he was arrested, and then he died. So the last 11 years of his life is almost dismissed, reduced to simply this. It's the Sunni sources. And I think that in this case, the argument made by Antoine Beirut, which is an argument grounded in this notion of an Abbasid Vulgate of history, really stands out. It's verified. But what are the Zaydi sources doing? And this is where I think Antoine's argument needs to be somewhat complicated. So there are four narratives here. The first one I've already given you, Abd Allah ibn Musab. The Zaydi sources offer three more explanations. And I'm not going to, and there's four Zaydi sources that I looked at. Razi, Isfahani, Natik, and Ali ibn Bilal. And I think it's important to, I'll just give you dating. Razi is in the 3rd, 9th century, the late 3rd, 9th century. Isfahani dies in 356, 967. Natik is 424, 1033. And Ali ibn Bilal is 5th, 11th century. So this is spread out over 200 years. This is going on. Razi is the figure who Hussein knows very well. It's who text that Maher's been working on has been the text authored by Razi. So I'm not going to go over I will explain. Let me do that right now. Razi and Isfahani offer a very similar account to what the Sunni accounts are, the poem account. But there's one critical difference in the way they present that story. They end it by saying, oh, let me tell you. When they tried to bury Abdullah, they couldn't do it. Like, lots of things go bad. Sinkholes appear, water fills the grave, lots of problems happen. And the idea here is to make sure, Sunni sources say, oh, he just died. And Tabari says, maybe he died of natural causes. Who knows? Coincidence. But the Zaydi sources are very invested in saying, oh no, there was an oath involved, and the man was cursed, and he deserved to die, and this is why. So these two sources go much further, Razi and Isfahani, in making clear to you that Abdullah did something very bad, and Yahya has some powers that he's using here. Now the second narrative is a conspiracy narrative, what I think of as the Medina conspiracy narrative. And the prototypical form of this narrative, Yahya gets lots of money from Rashid, and then he goes back to Medina, and he gives that money away. He gives it to the survivors of the earlier rebellion, in fact. He gives it to Qurayshi nobles. It's like, you're all poor now because of the rebellion. Here, have this money. So he distributes the money amongst Medinans. And according to some of these narratives, especially when you get to Isfahani and Natik, he does more than even that. It's not just he's giving out money, he's organizing. Like, he's covertly sending people out to start a new rebellion. Okay, so there's this Medinan conspiracy narrative that shows up. Isfahani goes very, very far. In Isfahani, Rashid captures one of his agents named Abd and then he says, oh, what you should do is write a letter back to Yahya and say, I've converted the entire caliph's court, because he's trying to draw him out. But as soon as the messenger reaches Yahya, Yahya takes the messenger back to an Abbasid agent and says, look what they're doing, they want me to rebel, but I'm loyal. And Isfahani clearly says that they had previously arranged that any of Yahya's agents got caught. If they sent a letter to Yahya, Yahya would know that it was a fake letter, and he would turn the letter in, and that would protect him. So there's a lot going on here, right? I mean, this conspiracy narrative is quite complicated. Then there's a companion names narrative, and this, again, is quite complicated, but at its basic level, what happens is Rashid keeps bringing Yahya forward and saying, name your companions. And Yahya keeps saying no. And the reason this is important is that the agreement that Yahya signed with Rashid said that he was protected, the Aman. but it also protected 70 of his followers. But it didn't name those 70 followers. So every time Rashid would arrest someone, Yahya would show up and say, oh, he's one of the 70. So he had essentially 70 get out of jail free cards. And he was using them. And Rashid just wanted the names. And according to these narratives, Rashid explicitly says, once I have the names, I will kill them all. Right? So the idea here is that Yahya is protecting his people. And in Isfahani's case, he's poisoned because of it. And in Nafik's case, he is starved because of it. So in these instances, he's being very heroic in protecting his people, who he knows will suffer if he gives up the names. And the final narrative is the lineage narrative. And in that narrative, which first appears in Isfahani, and this is a type of trope that appears in lots of Alad accounts. Yahya is brought forward, Rashid sits down with him, Rashid says, am I not generous? Am I not the most generous? And Yahya says, yes, you're the most generous. Am I not the best looking in appearance? And Yahya says, oh, yes, you are. And he goes up through this whole list of attributes. And finally he says, am I not as close to the Prophet as you are? In which case Yahya says, well, if the Prophet were around today, he could marry your daughter, but he couldn't marry my daughter. And that demonstrates the closeness of Alad genealogy, as opposed to Abbasid genealogy. And he embarrasses the caliph in that way, and according to a couple of these accounts, that makes Rashid so angry that he internally decides that I'm going to take this guy out. Right? So these are the four narratives that show up, and instead of going through them with each of these characters, or each of these accounts, I just wanted to lay them out for you so you can see what's happening here. Isfahani has all four of them. But the other Zaydi scholars, they only use parts. The reason I put crowds next to conspiracy with Ali ibn Allah is he's the last of the sources in the 5th century. And when he talks about conspiracy, it's in a completely different way. He says that Yahya shows up in Medina, and he tries to keep a low profile, but people gather around him, they're like, oh, it's Yahya. And so he's like a rock star. And so he has all these crowds around him, and somehow Rashid finds out, and then he hasn't organized anything in Ali ibn Allah. He's just an inadvertent rock star who is gathering support without realizing it. So this is what's going on, and instead of trying to explain it to you, I thought I'd just read a couple of conclusions that this sort of gives you. The first theme that shows up in the Zaydi sources is what we would expect. A reverence for the family of the Prophet. And this is particularly central to two of those narratives, the Abd Allah ibn Musab narrative and the lineage narrative. Three of the authors, Razi, Isfahani, and Nafik, include the poem version of this narrative, which disparages the Zubairis as pretenders, intent on creating friction between the Alawites and the Abbasids. This creates a degree of separation with the Banu Hashim, clearly in a position of superiority with respect to other Qurayshi tribes. The Zubairis are also pretty close to the Prophet in genealogy. The lineage narrative works in a similar manner, but focuses on the superiority of the Alawites to the Abbasids. So, whereas the first narrative talks about the Alawites in comparison to, and disparages the Zubairis, sort of keeps the Alawites and Abbasids on the same level, the second narrative, the lineage narrative, very clearly creates a hierarchy where the Alawites are on the top, the Abbasids are in the middle, and the Zubairis are at the bottom. The second theme that shows up in these accounts is a belief, is a controversy, and this is where the rhetorical aspect really shines through. Is the idea of an activist imam, and how important is an activist imam? And do you need to be an activist imam? Now, those of you who know about Zaydism know that the activist aspect of the imam is central to the Zaydi conception of what an imam is. He has to lead a rebellion. Now, this activist notion is embodied in the two other narratives, the conspiracy narrative and the companion naming narrative. These serve to further establish Yahya's revolutionary credentials, but they differ in the extent of their descriptions. Isfahani presents the most activist portrait, anchored in the incident that I mentioned, where one of Yahya's agents is caught, and then the whole trick that they devised within themselves. Isfahani later presents a version of the companion name narrative, in which Yahya's refusal to surrender his followers prompts the caliph to poison him. So he's willing to give up his life to protect his own people. Yahya is thus presented as a tireless rebel with tremendous loyalty to his followers. Nafik's account is only slightly less activist in its perspective, with Rashid revealing his knowledge of Yahya's thread network of agents. The idea is that he has this network that exists. And expressing great frustration at Yahya's refusal to identify his followers. The narratives of Razi and Ali ibn Bilal mute the activist aspects of Yahya's biography. Razi's conspiracy narrative is notably limited to his distribution of money. There is no indication that he dispatched agents to continue working against the Abbasid power. Razi does, however, offer a version of the companion naming narrative that includes poisoning, who I listed there. This highlights his loyalty, Yahya's loyalty to his friends, while also depoliticizing it considerably. Ali goes even further in this direction by utilizing Yahya's time in Medina to note his personal charisma and piety, as opposed to his organization of rebellion. Yahya makes significant efforts to maintain a low profile. When recognized, however, crowds gather around him. So, the narratives, the Zaydi narratives, speak to two aspects of Zaydi theology. They emphasize, albeit to differing degrees, the particular Zaydi reverence for the Alid family. This cuts across all Zaydi sources. There's more controversy, and this is the key point here in the whole talk. There's more controversy surrounding the activist qualities of a Zaydi imam. The earliest source offers limited evidence for Yahya's activist efforts in Medina. The next two sources, Isfahani and Natik, present Yahya as an energetic and principled rebel. The final source focuses almost exclusively on Yahya's charisma. The differences here are likely the products of a gradual standardization of the legitimate lists of Zaydi imams. There was a controversy as to whether Yahya was an imam. Zaydis fought about this because he didn't succeed. He failed. He died. He was a rebel, but he failed. He didn't set up an imamate, and then he accepted an agreement with the caliph. This is highly problematic. And so over those 2 centuries, when Isfahani and Natik are writing, really the 3rd and the 4th, the late 3rd and the 4th centuries, even getting into part of the 5th, there's a controversy as to whether Yahya belongs in a list of Zaydi imams. By the time we get to Ali ibn Bilal, that issue is settled. And so what we're more interested in is forwarding Yahya as a figure of piety and charisma versus other competing figures, in this case, most probably Musa Ghazan, the 7th Shi'i imam. The debate over the status of figures in the 2nd, 8th, 3rd, 9th century who failed to establish imamates led to competing biographies arguing for their inclusion or exclusion. The case of Yahya also required an explanation of his acceptance of a large sum of money. Whereas each author explained this as a means for paying off the debts of Alids, some authors were clearly motivated to further justify his actions. Given such debates, the activist interpretation of Yahya likely peaked with Isfahani before fading in the course of the 5th and 11th century. So those are 2 different ways of examining the same period in Yahya's life. And that's really most of what I wanted to say. And when you look at other aspects, you'll see similar things. To give you one quick example, when we look at the time Yahya spent in prison, the Sunni sources exclusively talk about the fall of the Barmakid family. And they say Yahya was instrumental in the fall of that family. Yahya is not important. Yahya is only important because he brings about the fall of this vizier. The Zaydi sources exclusively talk about how pious he was, how he convinced people of his piety in the course of his imprisonment. And they talk about the fall of the Barmakids, but they talk about it because they say, oh, the Barmakids sat down with Yahya. He was so pious. They were like, we gotta let him go. Because our afterlife is more important than this life. And so Yahya is an active central agent for the Zaydi sources, whereas he's just an explanatory factor for the Sunni sources. And here we see 2 very different notions of how to think of Yahya. In the case of Sunni sources, he's part of the Abbasid Vulgate that is interested in the Abbasids and kinship. In the case of Zaydis, it's more about internal theological debates. And really that's the only point I'm trying to make. The very last thing I'll say is that, and this is sort of the larger point of the book project itself, is that we think of Shi'i historiography as sectarian historiography. Oftentimes, Shi'i sources are dismissed as being inherently sectarian. They're not treated the way Sunni sources are treated. But I think this is problematic because we shouldn't be thinking of them in terms of content. We have to think of them in terms of method. And in terms of method, they're both utilizing rhetorical techniques to get around that issue. So instead of thinking of 12er sources as being, they're hagiographic, they're something else, we have to think of them in terms of doing the exact same thing. And And if they are united in method, then we can say that there is only a Islamic historiography. And to think of it as a historiography, I think is, to be perfectly honest, I think demeaning and dismissive of a tradition that is perfectly part of the larger corpus of literally Islamic historical texts. Thank you.
The floor is now open to questions.
Thank you for bearing with me with that.
Actually, it's a question about historiography, which actually seems to be the main point of your project. When you began reading, you said that you were reading skeleton chronology, or about the life and death of Yahya. What were you reading actually? From where did you get that?
The chronology?
That skeleton, it's again. So is it like, is it a novelty? Is it late? Is it early? And what did you? And then it connects it a little bit with your introductory remarks as well about child comments on historiography and your very severe comments on the Al-Hizri's work, and then be interested in hearing more about why you almost already dismiss of the work. So I'd be also interested in hearing.
Well, I mean, well, the first thing I'll say is that the structure I come up with is essentially found in a span of works. I mean, Tabari provides some of it, but much of the material about what happened to the movements of Yahya after the rebellion are primarily found in Akhbar Fakh, which is by Razi, which was Professor Girard is the one who edited that. And that just gives you, it doesn't say anything, it just says he was here, then he was here, then he was here. Tabari essentially focuses on only a couple of aspects: the birth, his presence in rebellions, and then his rebellion itself, which is treated the way I explained, and his death is only slightly mentioned. So what I'm really doing is bringing together what I can glean from all the different sources to come up with a skeleton. Part of the point I'm trying to make is that that skeleton is within the purview of the knowledge of an educated person of the time. So there's no need for Yahya or for Tabari or even Khatib to go through every step of that biography. He's just choosing to go through specific parts of what Yahya does in order to make a point. As for the Al-Hibri, I will say this. I mean, his early work was more measured in the kinds of things that he said. But I don't know if you've read his later work. But it's just, what Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Well, sometimes I think Tayyib just sees things. There's a Bakra in this account. So clearly this is a reference to Abraham and the story of the potential. There comes a point where you're no longer in the world of, you're applying your own set of ideas of what is important onto an entire corpus of literature. And some of those deductions may be accurate and true, and some of those references may be, may reflect what the author's been trying to do. But there comes a point where you're living in your own sort of segregated world. What Tayyib produces is very interesting. But to say that these were the thoughts that were going through the audience's mind when they were reading Tabari, I think is a huge presumption to be making. I think what we need to do is treat the audience of these accounts on their own terms, and on the basis of the text, try to figure out how the audience was engaging with the material, as opposed to saying, look at all I found, and the way I think about this material must be the way they thought about this material. And I think that's my biggest criticism of Al-Hibri, is that he projects his own understandings and readings onto an earlier community, and I don't think one can do that.
It's kind of a follow-up question also about the skeletal, in relation to genres of historiography. Because it seems to me that there's also a certain mode of organizing knowledge whereby the generic form determines content as well. And I wonder whether the skeleton sounded to me very biographical dictionary type, very tabaqat standard. But I wonder if you were to bring in other generic forms, how would it problematize the narrative, and what would it say about
that's a
the
great
systemic
question.
structure of historiography?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, I fully acknowledge that when I try to address it, it's something I'm still working through in my mind, because biographical dictionaries tend to give you more of an entirety of a life. If we look at Masudi or Tabari in particular, Tabari, all this material isn't in the same place. It's scattered. And so part of what I've been thinking about is, and this is why Cooper said, and Mesami generally work on biographical work as opposed to working on chronicles. And earlier, most of my early work was mostly on chronicles. I think that the way I've begun thinking about it is that the biographical dictionary goes further in presenting you the palette, whereas Tabari is using that palette to paint different portraits on the basis of that. So I think the biography gives you much more of, you know, the foundational material, because you're intending to Tabakats are doing lots of things, biographicals are doing lots of things, but one of the things they're doing is trying to frame a life in a very particular way. Now, interestingly, the Akhbar effect is not a biographical dictionary, but so it's much more of a chronicle that has biographical elements interspersed. So much of my skeleton comes from the Akhbar effect, and I am limited, and I admit as much, in drawing on Akhbar effect to get much of the skeleton. And I actually think that the biggest problem with this talk and this paper is just that presumption. The presumption, I still haven't gotten to the point where I can comfortably say that the skeleton that I've put forward is known to people. But then you're working, it's almost like a backward textual archaeology where on the basis of what authors are saying, you're trying to reconstruct what the people knew. So I don't know how much of this was known.
Yeah.
That's a big assumption. In fact, if I were to critique myself, I would critique myself on that very point, because it's something I haven't worked through. But I don't know how else one would do it. I mean, if Mesami is right, and if we are really looking at Roman historiography, it's very hard to know what the audience knew. And so we make certain assumptions. But I'm more comfortable with making that assumption backwards of an educated audience than I am with what Hibri does, which is saying that this is how I applied biblical topos to historical writing. And undoubtedly, that's what the audience then was doing. But your genre question, I think, is perfectly. I don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, and the follow-up to that would be, so I like the way you map out the theoretical entry point that you're coming into. But what then happens if you dismiss the fictional argument completely, right? What then happens to the kind of authorial parts of the text, right? That is authorship in the text that gives it precisely its rhetorical value, its performative functions, etc. What do you do with that then?
Well, I'm not arguing that any of these things necessarily happened. What I'm arguing is, and this is why I say you sidestep the issue of veracity.
You push it away.
Because you're acknowledging that there's a fictional element. I wouldn't like to use, that's why I don't try to use the word fictional. I say there's an elaboration that's happening. And it's an elaboration that's understood by the audience. There's also a veracity aspect to it. But instead of engaging on this binary of veracity versus fiction, what we're saying is that there is a truth element that is here, and there is an elaborate structure that is being built upon that truth element. And the audience is perfectly aware of what's being done. There's no misleading happening here. An audience that's listening isn't going to say, oh, this version is what really happened, and this version is what didn't happen. What the audience is saying is, well, I see what you're doing there, you know, and I'm understanding what you're doing. I know the story, and I know how, a good comparison to something I just thought about at the Boston Studies conference that we were at, the School of Boston Studies, is the Quran does very similar things to prophet narratives, where the prophet narrative is known, and the Quran tweaks it, right? So, I mean, who's to say that these historians weren't building off of a similar sense of engagement with narrative, where, you know, the story of Yusuf in the Bible is very different from the story of Yusuf in the Quran. But everybody who's reading that is aware of the tweaking that's happening, the shift that's happening. And so, who's to say that the Quran's story is truthful? But what's being done here is the Quran story is being used to make a point about the relationship of God to human beings. So the use of narrative in the Quran is very similar, I would argue, to the use of narrative by these historians. So again, there is a quote-unquote fictional element, but you don't have to make a choice between fiction and veracity.
No.
And as long as that negotiation as long as that contract is known between audience and author, there's no problem with it. One can't be critical of the material for being fictional.
I'm sure the content itself is also very much worthy of questions, but I'm also more interested in the...
I'm more interested in the historiography too.
But when you say rhetorical, to my mind, I analyze it into two elements, one of which would be a very strong oral component, perhaps an oral heritage in dealing with history. And another would be the, I don't know how to translate the word, which is perhaps the aim behind writing history itself is ta'ibah, it's learning the lesson. So maybe if you could think of this history, rhetorical as it is, as being aimed at different things, as being, the idea of tropes being relics of an earlier oral history, it could give us a different attitude or a different approach to reading it.
Well, I would argue that rhetoric in the Roman tradition didn't necessarily have to be oral.
No, at this stage it's already written.
Yeah,
It's a relic, perhaps. So they would deal with an audience as if it was listening, which leaves a room for someone to...
Well, European historians, to answer that point first, and I'll go back to the other one. European historians who deal with the medieval and the classical period have already gone through a lot. Everything I've said would not be surprising to them at all. But the problem with Islamic historiography is that we're still stuck in problematic, we haven't resolved these issues for ourselves. The transition from a rhetorical to a scientific history, I mean, this was done in the 1940s by European historians. It's an established idea. And I would argue that it's not necessarily it doesn't have to be oral. Writing can be rhetorical and performative. As
the way you are doing it,
Yeah.
you're giving a lecture.
Yeah, well, I guess.
It's already written, but in an oral manner you see that you use a certain language that we would understand, certain examples that we would understand. So if you think of the historian as doing something similar, maybe it would make different sense.
Now, as for the question about ibadah, or teaching, morality within the tradition, so I think that's definitely there. But I think that, I try to be as open about it as possible. I presented a theological readings because I do think that there's a Zaydi debate going on about what is an imam that underlies much of what's going on. And anyone who's reading these know that Isfahani is engaging to try to elevate Yahya in a way that, and Nathik is also, and Ali ibn Abd Allah doesn't have to worry about it anymore. And probably Razi is at the point where this is not even an issue yet. So what you can trace is a communal discussion that is happening, and everybody who's reading it is saying, "Oh, I see where Isfahani is coming in here," but this is not what this guy is saying. So the stories are a debate that is underlying inside it. But different accounts do different things, and this is part of what I'm saying. A rhetorical point or a rhetorical historian doesn't have to just engage in a debate over theology. A rhetorical historian could engage in a debate over what are the rights of a ruler over his people. So if you look at for example, depictions of Al-Hakim Abd Allah, people always say he's crazy because he comes off as crazy sometimes in debates. And I would say that this is on the edge of what was acceptable at the time when it comes to verisimilitude, because he comes off as just being woo everywhere. But essentially what's happening is, at those times where Hakim comes off as bad, it's because he's violating the moral expectations of how a ruler should behave with his population. So he's letting the black slaves, as they're described, loot fustat, right? And this is condemned by everybody. But then later on, Al-Hakim is murdered by his sister, according to most of the sources. And in those cases, he comes off as the most sympathetic human being imaginable. I mean, in the sources that he wakes up at night and he sees a star, and they say, "I'm going to die tonight," and his mother says, "Please don't go," and he goes, "I have to go," and he's weeping, and he loves his mom so much that he says, "I'm not going to go," and then in the middle of the night, he's compelled to wake up, and then he ventures out, and then he dies. He's a completely sympathetic figure. But that's because the historians are telling you a story about regicide, and how regicide is never justifiable. So there are also, what we think of as morality plays that are being examined here. But this is what I think the beauty of Maysami's approach is that it incorporates both of those things. Because the purpose of what the historian is doing is an engagement with lots of different issues. The rhetorical point doesn't have to be theological. It's not to say that this is all theological. It's not to say this is all biblical. It's not to say that this is all morality play or political. It's to say that whoever the historian is, Cicero could stand up there and say, oh, look, this is not how you treat your the Caesar. Another way he can say, this is how this is politically how you behave. Another point, he can present the narrative in 5, 10, 15, 20 different ways to emphasize different elements. And I think that's the more useful way of thinking of history, Islamic history, than to just reduce it to one of these dimensions. So it's a big arena.
That's fine.
Just to go back to the Sunni narrative, would you say that perhaps one of its main goals maybe was to use Yahya as a way to put about Ken between Abbas and Alids, maybe to rehabilitate the Alids,
or to explain the break, because over and over again, the Sunni sources say these two communities it's a tragedy that they fight. They should work together. So Tabari wants to explain why these two communities have never.
The other question, or it's just like a remark about the companions' names, of our 70, of course, 70 like the Karbala, 70 like the Umayyad dynasty, 70 or things. So is it that they're trying to imply that by not giving up the names, he's managed to forgo another
I think what's going on here is something that I didn't even mention.
It is more heroic actually than you've given him. Perhaps you.
I think he is. I think the problem is, I'll tell you, take a step back and tell you something I didn't say in the talk. There's two figures who are intimately tied together in the story. And this is, I always tell my students I'm lying to you, because I'm constantly lying to you, because I'm not telling you the whole story. But the other part of the story is that Yahya has a contemporary, and that's Musa al-Ghazan. And those two are intricately tied together all the time. And the Zaydis hate Musa al-Ghazan. They bring him up over and over again as this complicit traitor who wouldn't participate in the rebellion in fact. I was talking to Hussein about this. Oftentimes they present him as standing behind the Abbasids as they were passing judgment on Alids, as a coward in some ways, completely complicit with the Abbasids. That's how they portray him. The problem that they face then is that Yahya, who is this figure of resistance, he's the leader of the rebellion. Then, 11 years later, signs an agreement with Rashid in which he gets a hell of a lot of money. And he can do. He is a posh deal, and it feels like he's selling out. It feels like a total sellout. And so, what Isfahani and Maltik are doing is that in the face of Twelver criticism, are trying to salvage his activism. Because if I was a Twelver scholar, in 350, if I was a contemporary of, Ibn Babawayh or someone, I'm going to be sitting there and going like, oh, really? Yahya's that great? Same Yahya who gave up on his rebellion and instead of dying like our people do, or staying quiet, decided to sign a peace agreement? How is that a figure of resistance? So I think part of what's going on here with these accounts that emerged with Isfahani in particular is that Isfahani is desperately trying to salvage Yahya. And this is why it's a big issue, because the Zaydis have to figure out who's an imam. And if they're really going to use Yahya as a counter to Musa, then they have to establish that and what they end up doing is they end up saying, oh, he knew he was going to be betrayed. He knew that this Aman wasn't going to work. He was forced to accept the Aman because the people who were protecting him turned on him. There's a whole bunch of these accounts in the Akhbar Fiqh where, he basically comes to his protector and says, I give you 5 ways I will prove that Rashid is lying. And his protector says, no, too difficult, I don't want to do that. So he reframes Yahya in a way that makes him a desperate man who comes up with this agreement just to demonstrate how strong he is. the Imam is so good that Rashid can't get rid of it. The Imam gives him all this money to distribute amongst his people. He knows he's doomed to die, but this is just his last, effort to give him 10 more years of organizing. So this is what's going on. There's like a second era.
I'm just wondering, returning to the skeleton, whether the skeleton itself is also constituted by tropes and tropoi, and whether you can, and you kind of evoked it, but in passing, and whether that also constitutes.
Well, there's
part of
things
the
that we
story.
know.
The kind of rebellion, the peregrinations, which is very kind of familiar. Anyway.
Well, the things I can take things out. If you want to reduce the skeleton to things that everybody sort of agrees upon, happened, quote unquote, then we have his upbringing, we have his lineage connections, we have his sending of his relationship to Idris, who starts the Idrisi dynasty. All the sources acknowledge his participation as a leader of the revolt of Sa'd. Everybody acknowledges that he revolted himself later in Iran, and everybody acknowledges that he signed an imam, and then he was eventually arrested and he died in prison. So that takes out the peripatetic sort of wandering issues, but you still have that broad narrative that is assumed by everybody. No one denies that he rebelled. No one denies that he participated in the Sa'd rebellion.
I was not there.
Because I was thinking of you when I think of that. So, there are things that I can reduce the skeleton significantly. So, but yeah, you're right. You have to always worry that there are tropes that are.
But which is not a problem. I don't deem it as. I agree with you that the advantage of this kind of I associate with the Hayden White, but this trope type analysis is the sidestepping of the.
But I would have to say,
or
I break with Hayden White there. I think Hayden White takes it way too far.
Well, I'm just evoking Hayden White because he seems to me to be the kind of who launched this great venture of kind of guerrilla warfare and positivist historiography. But it sidesteps and which is the typical classical tradition which continued in Europe until the 19th century, incidentally. Early modern European historiography is imbued thoroughly in rhetorical tropes and
But where I would break though with that is that I give the author a lot more credit. I don't think the text.
The author.
I do think that there is an author making a point as opposed to a trope that takes on the left and so on, and allowing us to deconstruct that in a manner that separates the author from the text. I just think that takes it too far. I think that's where Hayden White helps. I think that's how Hayden White pushes Thayer al-Hibri off the cliff.
Just one question. Go back to the rhetorical uses, I think we call it rhetorical historiography. I think it's also important to try to highlight at least certain concrete examples of where this history is functioning as leverage. Because even if we agree on theoretical apparatus and we say this is rhetorical history, it needs to be said, well, this is clearly being utilized or being proposed or being reported for this rhetorical purpose. Do we have many examples of this? First. Second, and I'm aware that this is a book in the making, but basically we don't see any Imami source here. And since Musa Kazim, as you mentioned, is closely tied to Yahya, I think it would be also important to see where certain rhetorical devices are being used not against the Sunnis or the Abbasids or the Al-Badr, but against the Imams. And this will highlight things. One thing I caught my attention, for example, the Jewish thing, Al-Razi and companion names. Now, there are the names of the 70 people, and probably the relevance of the number 70 is there, but since I'm aware of the original text here, the Jewish names, the Jews who are supposed to be the guarantors of Rashid's Imam. If you look at it, eventually the story unfolds to be that these Jews were basically parts of the conspiracy, and they would give Rashid the loophole to break his Imam.
Only one Jewish.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a very important rhetorical device to see why this Jew is compared to Abu Bakr.
Yeah.
Will be mentioned to see where he stands in the dictionaries and the sectarian polemics. On the other hand, the question about him being coming back to Medina and distributing the money back to those who were descendants or participants in the earlier rebellion that failed. This is also basically a way of telling people that it's not a total sellout.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, you have to realize that this is the chapter. I have an entire section devoted to the repudiation of the Aman, in which I discuss the jurist's role in this.
and we have historical examples other than this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is one of 5 sections. This is one part of one of 5 sections. But I will say this, that there's one, I've only found one Imami source that directly engages Yahya. And that is, I believe, I don't want to lie to you, so I want to make sure I get, I'm trying to figure out whether it's, I think it's Yaqubi, but it might be Masuzi. Yaqubi.
If you count Masoudi as Imam, that's already another discussion.
I know. Trust me, I've noticed that too. But Yaqubi in particular, he does have something really interesting. He takes the biography of Yahya and he saves him. He presents narratives that save him as a descendant of the family of the Prophet, while disparaging him as an illegitimate rebel. So it sort of goes between the Zaydi position and it's like a bridge almost. But that's the only account I found. The next chapter, which I just finished, is on Musa Badr. And so Yahya reemerges in this narrative.
One last comment here, and I think within the Shia circles at least, within Imami or Zaydi, I think the main historical debate, if you're going to produce an historiography, is about where the fine line is between the persistent, naive approach to politics and being principled.
Oh, yeah.
They cannot portray him as being principled and forget about, for example, trusting Rashid as an act of political naivete. But then on the other hand, how can you trust someone like this to be an imam and lead? That's always the problem that they face. In the Ibn Qibla debate, later, a famous line where an imam is defending himself because he was accused of believing in a hidden imam who had been hidden then for 100 years almost. So I think it has more time now. But then he was being accused of believing in this, and the main comeback is that, well, you say that you should rebel, but can you please tell me when was the last rebellion?
Yeah. Zaydi, Musa, Shi'i depictions of Gaza implicitly make this argument, sometimes explicitly make this argument. They don't name Yahya, but and this is, again, I talk about that in the Musa chapter, is that the way they frame Musa al-Ghazan makes that very clear. There's no indication that his quote-unquote complicity with the Abbasids, that's what the Zaydis accuse him of, is interpreted by the 12 sources as political acumen and awareness that this is a failed endeavor, and so he's protecting himself and his followers from certain death by not participating in the rebellion. So what was interesting is, as I wrote those 2 chapters, I've been on sabbatical this semester, I wrote those 2 chapters, and I had no idea that the connection would be as strong as it was. But as I wrote the Musa chapter, I realized that those 2 chapters are almost invariably tied together.
What's the title of the book? The working title of the book.
It's completely deceptive. I can give it to you.
So what's the book about actually? This is what I meant. I understand that there are these 2 chapters, but what's...
Historiography, Islamic historiography. The title I was given by the publisher was Rebellion and Schism. Rebellion and Schism in Early Islam. But I'm going to change that in some ways. I'm trying not to put the word Shia in there because I'm always the go-to for Shiism.
Yeah.
And I would rather not be known as the go-to for Shiism.
But it is.
So if I just make it about early historiography, the 3 case studies in the book are Musa Kazan, Yahya bin Abdullah, and so the third one is on 12er historiography, the second one is on Zaydi historiography, this one, and the first one is on Abbasid historiography, and the case study is the Wasiyah of Abu Hashim, which I've already written on considerably. And what I argue is that Abbasid historiography is Sunni historiography. So it's a type of Shi'i historiography, and I'm trying to stay away from the word Shi'i, so it looks like I have 3 case studies that are all Shi'i. And each of the case studies deals with all the sources that are available. So it's not as if the Sunni case study is only Sunni sources. The 12er case study is 12ers and Sunnis and Zaydis. So the historical tradition that is most dominant occupies half the chapter, and the other sources occupy the other half of the chapter. But the point you make is absolutely clear. I will say this, that among Sunni sources, in the 2 Shi'i cases, we really should, I don't know people have read Antoine's work, but Antoine, makes a very strong case that there is what he calls a Vulgate, an Abbasid imperial history that imposes itself upon the larger tradition. And oftentimes what I find is that the Sunni tradition, the imperial Sunni tradition, adheres to that. I think Antoine misses the boat slightly. I've had this discussion with him a lot, is that he doesn't take into account that just because there was an Abbasid imperial history that you might find in someone like Tabari, doesn't take into account that there were provincial historical traditions and there were non-imperial traditions that need to be addressed as complicating that Vulgate. So in this case, you find that the Vulgate shines through in some areas, but there's Shi'i sources that are doing, the Zaydis in particular seem to always do their own thing. They don't care about the Abbasid historiography. They're not engaging in those imperial debates. They're working out their own issues in their own way. I think 12er sources are a little bit different because they have to take more account of what the Abbasids are saying and doing.
Even geographically, they were not living as distant as they were early on.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot going on here. I think that Antoine is correct in many cases, but I think that what he does, interestingly, is he does exactly what Abbasid propagandists want him to do, which is sort of accept that as the default historical tradition.
If it worked for 14 centuries, that's good.
Yeah. Now it's working amongst French scholars in the United States.
More questions? Okay, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.